Hey guys, welcome to the fourth of our Leading Social Change speaker series. So we have Rebecca Middleton with us. Rebecca and I have known each other 6-7 years, something like that. I collaborated with her on a program when I was teaching at Yale, when she was at the Alliance to End Hunger. And she is now the Chief Advocacy and Engagement Officer for the World Food Program USA, which is affiliated with the United Nations. So I'm so psyched to have her here to talk to you. Rebecca can wave. She's in her son's bedroom in his gaming chair, which she won't show you because the room she believes is a mess. I think it's very neat, but she has a really cool backdrop. But anyway, I thought you guys could go around and introduce yourselves. This is a small group. We know a lot of folks who have exams or on spring break, so this is recorded. And why don't we start with Caitlin, because I know you're. Why don't you just go ahead and then we'll go to Maddie from you. Do you want to just introduce yourself, Caitlin?
Yeah, hi, I'm Caitlin. I'm actually calling in from work right now. So I'm gonna have my camera off for most of this, but I'm with the Unpluggers team and I'm calling in from Southern California.
Hi, I'm Maddie and I'm with I'm calling from Colorado and I'm the No Social Media November team lead. Oh, do I pass it to someone? I'll pass it to Sam.
You want popcorn to somebody, Maddie? Yeah, pass it off.
She did. She passed it to Sam.
Sam?
Oh, sorry. It lagged out for a minute. Hi, I'm Sam. I'm working with Guider, and I'm in Knoxville, Tennessee.
How about Michael?
Hello, my name's Michael. I'm a student at Dartmouth College. I'm on the Legislate team. So we're trying to connect students with their local legislators and community organizations through legislative bill writing. And yes, I'm excited to hear the talk.
Kikoa, do you want to go next?
Sure. My name is Kikoa. I'm on the Eventually team, which is looking to centralize event management on college campuses. And I'm currently at Notre Dame and I'm in South Bend, Indiana on campus. And then David, you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, I'm David. I'm part of Team Mind, which is a mobile app to help teenagers gain self-awareness of their habits on social media. And I'm located at Oregon State University in Western Oregon.
I think Madison is next.
Hi, I'm just getting back from work, sorry. So I'm Madison, I'm from Team Legislate, and I'm currently in Rhode Island.
Perfect. So Rebecca, over to you.
Great, thanks, Julie, and thanks so much for inviting me to be a part of this. I have to say up front, I was incredibly interested when Julie was talking to me about this project overall, because I am the parent of 2 teenagers. And it was sharing a little bit with Julie and Susan before we got started, some of the experience I've had, particularly with my 16-year-old daughter over the last year, helping her to use social media in a thoughtful way for advocacy and allyship. So I'll share a little bit about that as we go on. But I'll just tell you a bit about myself, and then I'll give you a couple of examples of where I've really seen effective advocacy engagement by bringing together unlikely suspects. And that's happened throughout my career. So I've spent nearly 25 years in Washington, D.C. in the policy and advocacy space, sort of hit the 3 corners, I would say, that you think of as far as I've got government experience, starting out working on the Hill for my hometown congressman. I did that for 5 years, and it was really interesting until it got repetitive. So the thing that's interesting on the Hill is there are different policy pieces coming up on the macro level, but what you're doing day to day is generally more mundane and working with constituents, with individuals and organizations coming in on different issues. And what I ended up finding was just, you could almost set your calendar at the beginning of the year that this group was going to come in this week of the year for their annual advocacy day to talk about this issue that they always talk about. And I don't do well when I'm bored. So after a few years, where I'd sort of learned what I could and made some connections, I jumped to the lobbying side of things. And so I went to a firm. There are a lot of different ways to do lobbying, and it's not an evil empire. It's a really focused line of work where you know how to do something really well, you know how a process works, and you work with clients to work through that process. Just like I wouldn't try and figure out how to run electricity in my own house. If I didn't understand the lobbying space or the advocacy space or how to get things done in Washington, you want to hire somebody who knows how to do that. And that was an amazing experience. I did that for 11 years, worked with a range of clients from Fortune 500 companies, Siemens, Intel, Airbus, some nonprofit entities like University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, Cerner, the big electronic health records platform. And what was really valuable about that time and about that experience was sitting in boardrooms with executives, thinking about what their institutional objectives were and goals were, and how to use the legislative process to advance those goals. Sometimes it was pretty mercenary in that, University of Pittsburgh had some great research that they did with athletes like Tiger Woods, and they used advanced biomechanics analysis to look at some strength benefits and deficiencies, and they developed a really customized training program for athletes to both improve strength and performance, but also to mitigate injury. And so we worked with special forces, first of all, the Navy SEALs, to say, hey, you are the elite athletes of the military. You spend $1 million to train a Navy SEAL. If that person blows their ACL in their first mission, that's $1 million that's gone out the door, and you don't have that operational effectiveness. And so we were able to get money from a few key senators to fund a program to use that sports medicine technique on special warfighters. It's one of the ones that I probably enjoyed the most, because you could really see the benefit of that to the end user, and to the country as a whole. But after doing that for about 11 years, it's like, okay, I've got these relationships. I understand the process both from the Hill recipient side and from the institution, initiator side. But I wanted to focus in on a specific issue, and I really wanted to do something that I felt like was going to make a difference. And so looked at the skills and knowledge that I had, and then also did some discernment around what issues matter to me. And one that had always been near and dear to my heart was the issue of hunger, both US and around the world. I'm old enough that when I was in school was you've probably heard about the big famine in Ethiopia in the mid 80s. We Are the World and all of that. And that was one of the most formative memories of my childhood. I even remember, and this is honest to God truth, I came down one night after watching the news and hearing about what was going on in Ethiopia and how the World Food Program was addressing it, and brought down my literal piggy bank. I think in fact it was this glass pig with the plug in its stomach. And I asked my parents to send the money to the World Food Program. And so I'm actually gonna get emotional thinking like, this is what I get to do in my job now. But that drove me to say, okay, hunger is an issue I want to focus on. Here's what I do well. And so I was fortunate enough to join a group called the Alliance to End Hunger. And I loved the Alliance. I still love the Alliance, because the whole philosophy behind it is getting together a wide range of stakeholders who care about the issue of hunger in some capacity, domestically and or internationally, to sit down together, to learn from each other, to share what they're working on, and then find ways to partner. So it's private sector, faith-based organizations, universities, traditional nonprofit actors. And I spent 8 years there, and really found the most rewarding piece of the work was when you could get groups that normally wouldn't work together to find alignment on an issue and decide to do something together. And it really had an amazing impact, because you'd go to meet with a member of Congress and they'd say, okay, business, I know what you usually talk to me about. University, I know what you usually talk to me about. And Islamic Relief USA, I know what you usually talk to me about, but what are you all doing here together? What's the shared value that you're coming together to take your time and meet with me on? And of course, the issue was hunger. And it was dynamic that I had never seen in Hill meetings. Usually it's very bilateral. I don't want to say transactional, because that's an overly cynical way to put it, but it's here's what I want to tell you, here's what I'm asking for, responding to your questions, making the relevance to your district, next. Whereas this was, nobody had a strong individual interest in the issue. It wasn't that the business was going to make a lot of money off of it, or the church was going to recruit a lot of new parishioners. It was just something that they shared as a value, and they felt strongly enough about it that they wanted to communicate that to elected officials to get them to take action. And I'll give you an example too of where that relationship building really helped. So one of our private sector members, they no longer exist as an entity, but you've probably heard of Monsanto. They're now part of Bayer. And so Monsanto is one of our corporate members. And I will say during the membership vetting process, so we had a committee of the board that would vet any potential member just to make sure that there was good alignment, they were coming to the organization for the right reasons. Monsanto went through the ringer, but it became very clear that they wanted to come to build relationships and to learn. They weren't coming to sell anything. And they were a really good partner. And one of the best stories was they got to know some of our NGO members as well. And one of our NGO partners was hearing from some of their folks in the field. It was in Central America, I can't remember the exact country anymore, but that there was a huge issue in getting inputs that were needed by farmers. And the fingers were getting pointed back at Monsanto. And so instead of putting out a press release or going on social media and bashing Monsanto for causing food insecurity, they reached out to the contact at Monsanto that they'd met through the alliance and said, hey, we hear this is going on, have you heard about this and what do you think? And the person at Monsanto said, I'm so glad you reached out. We know about this issue. It's not our issue. It's actually an issue with USAID, the US Agency for International Development. And so in this instance, the NGO and Monsanto, because they had this personal relationship of contacts, were able to come together and work to push through this barrier that was being set up by USAID. And so it was just a really rewarding example of by having folks who may disagree. I mean, some of our NGO partners thought Monsanto was evil incarnate, but on the individual level, on the personal level, they got to know each other and built even just a little bit of trust because they had this shared connection to the alliance and this shared value of wanting to do something to end hunger. And I think that that's something that has kept me in the hunger space, and actually, in addition to my strong personal connection, helped bring me over to the World Food Program USA. So I've been here since last July. Very weird changing jobs in the middle of all of this, but I'm sure you all have interesting experiences about going to or returning to college in the middle of all this too. So the World Food Program USA is the US 501c3 that supports the UN World Food Program through advocacy, fundraising, and communications and marketing in the United States. We've been in existence about 25 years. And the reason I said yes was twofold. One, just the focus of the mission on the folks that are literally at risk of starvation because of lack of food. I care very much about hunger in the US, but at the end of the day, I mean, except in an extraordinary, bizarre circumstance, nobody in the United States is dying of starvation. Due to lack of access to food. Whereas, I mean, Yemen right now, there are 2 million children that could die this year because of famine. And so just being able to play a small, tiny part in that. The US government is the largest single funder for the World Food Program and always has been. This is the 60th year of the World Food Program. And the US usually provides between 30 and 40% of the overall assets to the World Food Program. And that's a combination of cash and then also in-kind commodity assistance from US farmers. So just being able to focus in on that. But the other piece that really drew me here, and in full disclosure, I was not looking to move. I love the Alliance. We were doing some really impactful stuff around COVID and particularly on the domestic side. The other piece that drew me here was they rewrote this job description to very specifically include working with coalitions and working with partners on advancing our goals around advocacy for the World Food Program. And that's something that's always really appealed to me, is bringing in allies, bringing in unusual allies on an issue where there's that shared value. And the other piece too on the issue of global hunger, unlike domestic hunger, which is really unfortunate because it didn't used to be this way, but global hunger is still a very bipartisan unifying issue. So this might surprise some of you who don't follow this really closely, but one of the biggest champions that we've had year over year, and particularly the 4 years of the immediate past administration, was Senator Lindsey Graham from South Carolina. He was chair of the subcommittee in the Senate that funds USAID and State Department. And regularly the administration's budget was zeroing out the foreign assistance programs. Just, this shouldn't be a priority. This isn't what we should be spending our money on. And Lindsey Graham was one of the biggest champions to say, no, we absolutely must make these investments. It's vital to US interests and it's the right thing to do. And restoring those funds back almost to 100% of where they were previously. So it's a fun issue to work on because it's frankly one of the only places that I know of where there's pretty much universal support on both sides of the aisle. There are a couple of fringe members on the Republican side who just fundamentally don't believe in multilateralism and think that the UN shouldn't exist. But even with some of those folks, they still like the World Food Program because it's so tangible, so impactful, and so tied to US values and US work. So it's another place where, do you really expect, Lindsey Graham and Kirsten Gillibrand to agree on an issue? But they do agree about supporting the World Food Program and the US investment in this work. So that's just a little bit, Julie asked me if there were sort of a couple of tips I wanted to share just from my career experience and also just being around my kids and some of the advocacy they're doing through social media. So one is be persistent. So be very clear in what you're asking for. Just saying, I want you to end hunger is not an effective message. Saying, I believe that no child should go to bed hungry, and these are the programs that I want you to support to that end. Childhood nutrition reauthorization for school meals and school breakfast and school lunch. On the global side, the McGovern-Dole school feeding program out of the Department of Agriculture. So being very specific. Another piece is do your homework and find alignment with the member of Congress. So if you're looking at the federal level, 100 senators, 435 representatives, you take the exact same approach to all of them, you're not going to be nearly as effective as if you do research on the member, find out what issues they're really focused on, and see if there's alignment with the issue you're trying to talk about. So hunger is an easy one to do that because it falls through a lot of different lenses. So it could be nutrition, it could be agriculture, trade, national security, just the humanitarian side of things, gender, climate. So we did that at the Alliance and we do that at the World Food Program USA. Okay, the member who's really interested in climate. And so let's talk about how climate change is driving hunger, but also some of the work that the World Food Program and other organizations are doing to create resilience for the folks that they work with to mitigate these climate shocks that are happening. And I find that so much more effective because even if you ultimately want to get that person to come around on an agriculture issue, if you start where they're already focused, you're going to be much more successful in building the relationship and getting the engagement, and then you can help take them to where you ultimately want them to go. So it takes some time and it takes some work to figure out what that match is, but it's absolutely worth it. Tying in any way you can to a constituent or other stakeholder that matters to that member of Congress. And so, is there a tie to a district? Is there a tie to the state? Is there an institution, whether it's a college or university or a company that's in that district or supports that member of Congress that you can bring in as an ally? That makes a ton of difference. And then the last thing I would say is be persistent, but also don't be a pest. So I had a colleague when I was lobbying, and his entire background prior to coming there was on the campaign side. And I'm using campaigns in this sense to mean a political campaign. So you've got a candidate that you're working with to try and get elected to office. So there's a very clear timeline, there's a very clear deadline, and you've got a very clear goal in mind. And in that environment, you can't afford to not be a pest. You always have to be in folks' faces. I don't know if any of you signed up for any of the things that were going on around the presidential, but I was getting multiple texts a day to give money or take action or do voter turnout types of activities, because the clock is literally ticking. On the policy and advocacy side, that approach can turn you into a pest really quickly. And I know from when I was on the Hill, I know from when I've been in the lobbying and advocacy space, there is such a thing as too much, and it becomes a bit of an art in knowing when and how to engage with a member or staff. So if you're every day pinging somebody, they're going to end up tuning you out. But if you're thoughtfully looking at, okay, there's a hearing coming up that relates to this issue, and I want to make sure the staffer knows that this hearing is relevant to the thing that we've been talking with them about, that's an appropriate thing to share. Or if there's something in the news or something's emerging, those are good moments to check in. But sort of I'm signed up for Global Citizens emails, and I get them all the time, and I just end up ignoring them because it's, okay, you asked me something the day before yesterday. I don't have time to do something for you today. Now, that said, if you're getting up to one of those moments that's really critical, checking back in, providing any additional support you can, and just making sure that if the member has things that they need from you, that you're being responsive to them too. So that was that. And then the story I shared before we logged on was about my daughter. So she's 16, she's a sophomore in high school. She was really interested in providing some allyship last summer around Black Lives Matter. And yeah, she has Instagram. We're not cruel parents. We know that that's particularly in this COVID time, how a lot of kids are connecting with their peers and with their community. But one of the rules is we have to follow you. You can't have a private account. And so I noticed Sarah was posting, one day, I think it was 15 or 20 stories on Instagram about, things going on with Black Lives Matter. And I appreciated her passion, and I didn't want to damp that down, but I also wanted her to understand that sometimes less is more. And this gets, again, to that point about you can be a pest. So, we talk through, what's most effective. How do you pick the most thoughtful 1 or 2 stories a day to share on an issue? I've seen that just this last, 48 hours around a lot of things about violence against women and sexual assault against women. And I think anybody on social media has seen a lot of those posts. But picking something that's really well sourced, so who's putting it out there and making sure that's reputable, but then picking the 1 or 2 best in a given day, just so that it's not becoming noise that's too easy for folks to tune out. I think too, it's been a really good lesson to help her think about how she engages with social media generally. Again, this is part of why I was really interested in the project, and I'd love to hear from you all. But it's a super powerful tool, but it can also just be this overwhelmingly negative force in folks' lives. And how do you use it for good, and how do you use it for empowering yourselves and others, and you're receiving information in an appropriate way without having it just suck you down this rabbit hole. So I think that's the other thing too, just generally with going back to advocacy and what's effective there, along with bringing in unlikely allies, is sometimes stepping back and going the old-fashioned way, making a call, or even, depending on the member and the relationship, asking for a meeting. You might feel a little bit like your grandparents doing that, but because so few folks do that anymore, it's actually much more effective than sending 1,000 generic emails. So with that, I will stop my monologue and open up to any questions you have about stuff I mentioned, other stuff you're interested in. I'd love to know a little bit more about some of the things that you're working on, particularly as they might relate to sitting down with folks you don't agree with. Oh, and there's one more example I'll give right now, just on the global food security side of things, on where I'm really frustrated right now. So there's this Food Systems Summit. It's a UN Food Systems Summit that's happening in September. It's being hosted by the Secretary General around the UN General Assembly, similar to the Climate Summit from a few years ago that you might remember. And the idea has been to be very inclusive, think of food systems very holistically, to include smallholder farmers all the way up to ag, big ag, everything in between, have civil society and NGOs and private sector at the table. And just a couple of weeks ago, there was an article that I think it's almost 300 civil society organizations around the country are publicly announcing that they're not going to engage with the Food Systems Summit because private sector has a role at the table. And they feel like private sector is disproportionately represented. I know some of these groups wouldn't sit down if any private sector folks were at the table, but there's some in there that I'm a bit surprised by. And it's really unfortunate because I know the summit and the folks working on it have been very mindful of having a seat at the table for everybody. And I've seen over and over that by just walking away, it's the least constructive or productive thing that you can do, unless maybe your goal is to raise money for your own cause. And I realize that's a super cynical reading, but I've been in this business too long to not really see another angle on it. Because even if you sit down, Cargill, who's been a partner from the Alliance, they're partner with the World Food Program and the World Food Program USA. Are there things that they could be doing better from a food systems perspective? Probably. But if you're not sitting down at the table and engaging with them and talking about it, they're never going to get there. If you just write them off and walk away, you've just essentially given up, because throwing bombs is not going to make change. So I hope, excuse me, I hope that it gets back on track. Excuse me, and the summit will happen no matter what. But it's counterproductive, in my opinion, and in my experience, for these civil society groups to be walking away from engagement there. So with that, I will end, Julie.
Yeah, I have 50 questions, but I'm not going to ask them. I'm going to let the team ask them. I'm going to put everybody on gallery view. So you guys, if you're there and can pop your screens back on, if you have enough internet. And I wasn't texting, I was taking notes because I couldn't find my pen. So I just wanted you to know I was using my phone for good while I was listening.
I zone out when I speak. It's like old school where Will Ferrell's character gives that great debate speech and he doesn't know what happened afterwards. I kind of do the same thing. So I didn't even notice.
Okay, good, perfect. Because I was trying not to be, trying to be a good role model for our amazing people. So I just open it up. Feel free. I mean, it's a small enough group, so feel free to jump in and even comment on each other's comments, or build on and all of that. This is a discussion, not just. I mean, it's a Q&A, but it's a discussion. This is your place to learn. So I'm sure.
And I think you guys can all unmute. I was just on a panel yesterday and they said, if you're all unmuted, it's more it can be an easier conversation. And I really appreciated that. And Caitlin, I know you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I can kick it off. It was really, really interesting listening to you talk about how you kind of had this idea as a kid, something you were really passionate about, and then just took it to your whole career. And you made it sound super easy, which I'm sure it was not. And I think it's so admirable, but it's hard for myself and my lookup peers when we think about if our passion is tech awareness, what avenues do you recommend that we could go down for that? Or how could we try to accomplish what you've accomplished when there isn't really that kind of structure in place?
That's fantastic. And I shouldn't have made it seem like it was such a straight line, because it absolutely wasn't. I mean, in there, I think when I was the kid, I think I wanted to be a librarian, and somewhere in there, I wanted to be an aerospace engineer. And then I knew I wanted to be an English major, but realized that on its own was really not going to be constructive. So what could I double major with? And I interned on the Hill and found out that I really liked the policy side of things. My virtual background is doing weird things, sorry. Some folks really love the policy space and sort of the sausage making that goes on there, and an internship is a great way to test it out. Because some people really don't like that at all and find it tedious and boring, and it's more like West Wing and less like Veep, although Veep is freaking hilarious. That's been my COVID watch. So what I see looking back, I mean, this job didn't exist when I started my career. So it's not like I sat there in 1997 and said, oh, in 2020, I'm going to be the Chief Advocacy and Engagement Officer of the World Food Program USA. But what I did was kept building skills. So, understanding the policy process, the communication skills, the relationship skills. I think that's one of the things that I've learned over time is one of my greatest professional skills is the ability to build relationships and engage folks and find ways to, align another institution's interests with the interests that I'm trying to advance as well, and find that shared value. And that's one of the reasons why they recruited me over to this position. I didn't apply for this job. They found me. I mean, I did eventually, but it was sort of that marrying of skills that you're building over time, along with sort of those things that motivate you and really drive you. Part of what pushed me into the nonprofit space, it was my kids on two levels. So one was just very practically, my youngest was going to school. Both my kids are public school kids. And so not having childcare costs allowed me to explore some career options that, I didn't have. My husband was very happy in his job. He wasn't looking to move. I was, I'd like some new opportunities. And I looked at some things staying in the private sector and looking in the nonprofit side of things, and was able to take a salary cut because we didn't have childcare costs, just to be really blunt about it. And then the other thing too with kids was, let me just say, I wasn't getting invited to talk at like bring your parent to work days, right? Like who wants to talk about lobbying for helicopters? Although that was pretty cool, I have to say. I did some neat stuff with that client. But in all seriousness, what am I modeling for my kids as far as how you're spending your time and devoting your time? And focusing on an issue that really matters and makes a difference was just something I felt really strongly about. My mom was the executive director of a nonprofit when I was growing up, and I always really admired that about her. Big caveat here, though, like you don't have to go in a nonprofit to do good things. And I think this is one of the myths that I see all over the place, is that you can only do good in a nonprofit. Couldn't be further from the truth. There are folks in government doing extraordinary, amazing things that are at a scale that nobody in the nonprofit space, except maybe at the Gates Foundation, could ever take on. And similarly in the private sector, there's some really great work going on in certain businesses, not even in the foundation side of things, but in the core business side of things. A lot of good work going on aligning around the Sustainable Development Goals. You're probably seeing a lot of these zero net carbon emissions pledges that companies are making. And so what it means to do good can mean lots of different things and manifest in a lot of different ways. But I think it's finding like what you really care about with your skills. My husband's another good example. He does nothing that has anything to do with what I do. He's a data guy. So his whole career, he's been that person that translates the tech needs and the business needs as it relates to data analytics. And so he worked for a private sector company for almost 25 years, and then said, hey, I've got this really good skill set. How can I take that and put it toward a cause that I care about? He now is vice president for technology at AARP. And so he's taking these skills that he honed on the private sector side and is applying them now to AARP's mission. So again, just thinking about what you care about and what you're good at and how those things align. But there's no roadmap, there's no path. And it's hard, right? Because you're sitting there and you've had a path the whole time. You like take really rigorous classes and you get good grades and you score well on standardized tests, and then you get your choice of great colleges to go to. And then you have to make a choice. And that's probably the first big choice in all of that any of you had to make, was like, which of these great options in front of me am I going to say yes to? And then from there, what are you going to major in, and what internship or externship are you going to do? But at each point, what I found at each phase of my career, like, things have narrowed in a bit more. So when you work on Capitol Hill, I was working on 50 different issues, everything from agriculture to defense to healthcare to telecommuting, which was a really novel concept back in the late 90s. And as I went forward in each stage of my career, that focus got more narrow until now it's not even just hunger, it's global hunger, and not even global hunger, but the UN World Food Program. So it's one thing that I do just offer as advice is, as you're looking at opportunities, how is this either opening up new areas where you can build out skills or knowledge, or how is this narrowing things in to make you more of an expert to take you deeper in that role? That's a long answer to your question. Sorry.
That's a great answer though. Thank you. Like, I appreciate the expansion.
Anyone else have a question? I'm sure there are more. Michael, I see you nodding. Did you want to jump in?
My Wi-Fi is a little unstable, but I was wondering, you were talking about when you worked for the Alliance to End Hunger, and also when you were talking about the Food Systems Summit, this theme about bringing different groups together who may have like different agendas, who may not agree with each other. I was wondering if you have any tips on how to do that, maybe like any negotiation techniques that you use, and how to really form those relationships between people and groups with different goals.
It's a great question. And I'd say at the Alliance, one of the real advantages we had there is that we were at that 50,000 foot level. So we were looking to build the public and political will to end hunger at home and around the world. That was our agenda. Our agenda was not, are we doing that through agricultural technology and CRISPR, or through traditional agroforestry methods. And as a result, we had credibility to bring together a conversation that included both, Monsanto, I'll pick on them since they don't exist anymore, but Monsanto and anti-biotech folks in the same space to sort of bring that conversation up a level. So to get out of the how a little bit and get more into the what. And that's where we were able to build some of that trust. So some of it was, frankly, just me working to build the bilateral relationships with the contacts. So they got to know me and they got to trust me and they got to trust the organization as a, in turn. And then leveraging that trust to say, I realize that this is somebody who's throwing bombs at you, or you're throwing bombs at this person. But I think that there's space where we could work together. I'll give you a great example. In the Obama administration, there was a lot of talk going on around trade and different trade agreements. And one of the best things that we did during that time was bring together private sector and civil society organizations. Many of the civil society groups didn't think that these trade agreements should even happen because they thought that it tilted the scales and ultimately was in favor of private sector over civil society. But what we did, we said, okay, like let's set aside whether or not trade should happen. And if trade is happening, if these trade agreements are moving forward, how can those be structured in a way that they are first doing no harm, but then ideally, advancing food security for the populations that are involved. And so by taking that sort of divisive macro issue off the table and just sort of parking it and saying, we're not going to talk about whether this should happen, but if this happens, then how do you create pieces? And then that's where they found so much more commonality. So that was incredibly rewarding. And I know some of those relationships and conversations still persist to this day. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much.
Sure.
And Sam, you're coming. Oh yeah, go. Who's that?
Oh, it's me. It's David.
Oh, go ahead, David.
I had a question that builds on that a little bit. I know you mentioned there was the public sector versus private sector and different misconceptions about what the private sector can accomplish versus the public sector. How do you navigate that as either like a public business or a private sector business? How do you work across the two sides?
I think what you do is you have a really well articulated vision of what you're hoping to accomplish, and ideally a couple of goals to support that vision. And then you just go and you say, hey, here's what we're trying to accomplish. Here are some ideas that we have, and here's how we think this could go forth. Do you see alignment with what you're doing here? For instance, social media is everywhere. Social media can be a force for good, or it can be a force that's not good for anybody involved. How do we work together, private sector, public sector, civil society, to nudge, encourage, coerce, regulate social media to be a force for good? And so different folks might have different levers that they control, but if they're all aligned on the vision and see what piece they play in moving toward that vision, then that's where you get the maximum benefit. So everybody's not going to be able to do the same thing. Google's not going to be able to do the same thing as US Congress, as I'm going to make up an organization like the National Parent Teacher Student Association. But if they all have a shared vision and see which piece they're playing in advancing toward that vision, that's where you can really see progress. I think one of the other things too in these is, and this is something I suggest to all of you, is not always going in with something fully baked. So you can go in with a nominal vision and say, here is something we're thinking about. I'd really like your input on how we could make this better or make this stronger, or who else we should be talking to. And that's where you can also build a lot of social capital and ultimately stakeholder buy-in for what you're trying to accomplish. Is not saying, I've got it all figured out here, sign off on it. It's, I've got an idea, you've got expertise, help me think this through. And then you find some really amazing partners for the journey.
Rebecca, I just want to jump in for a minute here and ask you how you think the steps, the concepts about relationship building, we've talked about at the federal level, and even in some way the UN level, which is a whole nother question to ask at some point. How does that all work? But is, I'm looking at some of these faces too, and they're interested in the local level, like at school districts or in states. How do you translate what you were talking about at the federal level, say, into a local school district or a state level?
Yeah, I mean, it's all very similar. I will say local politics I find are much messier than national politics. I'll never do local politics. But it's the same kind of concept. In fact, the more local you get, the more relational it becomes. Now, the flip side of that is in some cases, the more personal it becomes in a bad way. It could just be like Hatfields and McCoy's kind of situation. But again, if there's something where you can find that alignment and shared value, and it might be taking some time to bring things together, but you look at where folks on opposing sides come together. They come together around civic engagement groups. They come together around schools. I'm sure, I'm just thinking like at Notre Dame, I'm sure if Notre Dame invites in two people from South Bend, who may be on opposing views of an issue, but it's an issue that matters to Notre Dame, and they want to try and come up with a solution, both those folks are going to show up, and they're hopefully going to show up with the intent to try and do something productive together. The other sort of deep secret on the federal level, and this is true on the local level as well, is while folks on different sides of the aisle may be throwing press releases that are just flaming the folks on the other side, behind closed doors, they want to find ways to work together. There was a conversation just last week with 2 Republican freshman members of the House and 2 Democrat freshman members of the House to talk about the World Food Program and global hunger. And they are all so excited to have something that they can do together. There was a resolution that we did last year when the World Food Program won the Nobel Peace Prize. And it was, broad bipartisan support of sponsors. And it was, the Senate one actually unanimously passed in the Senate, which nothing unanimously passes in the Senate right now. Mm-hmm. So same thing, just a different scale. And that's also one where you almost need to do even more legwork to find out who's the person that, this town council person really trusts and looks to for advice and guidance on what issues to get engaged on. And also sometimes you've got to identify who you can't work with. Locally here, my home county, where it's fascinating to see how quickly things have changed, but they used to have a chair of the Board of Supervisors who actually got fired from the Trump campaign because he was too extreme. And, I don't know how you try and find common ground to work with him. I mean, he had it all figured out. He had all the answers. He didn't need to engage with anybody else. So sometimes it's knowing who you just can't work with. Like Rand Paul is almost impossible to work with in the Senate, just to not put too fine a point on it. And on the flip side, like AOC has some really strong opinions that you're not going to be able to budge her off of to try and find some middle ground either. So it's on both sides. I'm not trying to cast aspersions in a partisan way, but more often than not, folks are going to want to work together. And so if you've got something, again, thoughtful guidance and regulation around social media so that it's a tool for good instead of a tool for harm, that's a pretty unifying issue. The how is where you start to get into some disagreement over how highly regulated versus how much of it is individual choice. But you can at least agree that you don't want it to be a platform that's accelerating depression, anxiety, and suicide among youth. I don't think you're going to find anybody who disagrees with that, right? So, nobody wants those things to be advancing. Almost everybody has a personal connection to that in some way. And so if you start there, you're able to then find the threads that will connect folks through. Again, another long answer. Sorry, Julie.
Kind of going off of that, I was going to ask something kind of similar. So you were talking about making connections, whether that be with representatives or in the Senate. And I was just curious if once you get those connections, once you have someone to talk to, I was just wondering if you had any good advice for almost how you pitch your idea or your product to them in a way that is kind of a surefire way of getting them on board a little bit. Like, I was just curious, like how, once you finally have that contact, how do you go about that?
So a couple of things. One is to always work with the staff because ultimately the member is the decision maker, but the staff really is the gatekeeper. And so if you can get staff on board, you're 2/3 of the way there already. And to get staff on board, one of the things that helps the most is what I mentioned earlier, which is aligning it with something that the member has already put a stake in and said, this is an issue I care about. And then also looking around and saying, who else could be allies that already have that influence in this office? And I don't just mean that from somebody that gives them money. I think that's way oversimplified and blown out of proportion as far as how much influence that ultimately has. But it could be, perfect example. So one of our partner organizations at the Alliance, and still at the World Food Program USA, is a Christian advocacy organization called Bread for the World. They've been around for 40 plus years, and they do advocacy on hunger, both domestic and international. And back around the year 2000, there was this huge push in the global hunger community and global humanitarian community generally for debt forgiveness for low-income countries that had more debt than they were ever going to be able to pay off. And it was this millstone around their necks as they were trying to have economic development and economic growth for themselves and their citizens. And Bread for the World found out that Spencer Bacchus, who was at the time a member of Congress, and he was the chair of the committee in the House that influenced these issues, happened to have a connection to a church where Bread for the World had some activists. And so they were able to get the head of Bread for the World to speak at this church on one of the days that Spencer Bacchus was in attendance. And after that, everything fell into place. Bacchus absolutely got it, but it was because you had the affinity and the social capital of the community that he was a part of aligned on this issue. And so it's looking around and saying, who are natural allies that are already on the inner circle with the person I'm trying to influence. It's not always easy. Sometimes it's really just talking, but at the local levels, very often, I know like school board candidates here will put individual names of who their supporters are on their websites. And you can look and say, okay, that's somebody who we know, or this is somebody who has signed a petition for us. That's a really good way to find those folks to take in alongside you.
Thank you so much.
More questions, guys? We've got a few more minutes.
Yeah, Rebecca, I was going to ask, first of all, thank you so much again for coming and speaking with us today. And I was going to ask, like, how do you like decipher if someone who's like going to help you and like contribute to your mission, if their motivations are pure or not? I know like we talked about this intersection with the private and public sector, like how private corporations are not just helping so that can maybe like expand into that market or something and control it. Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, well, and I would just say, just because a private sector entity has a business interest doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad thing, right? I mean, pushing it and controlling it, obviously that would be a problem. But Unilever has been really engaged in the expanding the Sustainable Development Goals just broadly, partly because it will lift folks out of poverty and provide them with more disposable income, so in turn they can buy more soap. So there is a business interest in that, but it doesn't make what they're trying to do inherently evil. And I think that if it's to create a monopoly or to distort the system or to, I think the worst case is if it's to sort of take away choice and access for a specific group so that they only benefit from it. That obviously is something you really want to steer clear from. But just because Johnson & Johnson might sell more Q-tips doesn't mean that it's inherently a bad thing. So I think that's the question is sort of what's the motivation? I've seen instances where companies are sometimes almost too sensitive around that. I know some of the domestic grocery manufacturers, for instance, are really reluctant to engage in advocacy around SNAP. So for those who aren't familiar, that's the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, formerly called food stamps, because they feel that it would seem too self-serving, because in theory, if you increase the amount of the SNAP benefit, somebody could buy more Frosted Flakes. So I think a lot of companies who are concerned about their public image and concerned about sort of their corporate stewardship can almost put more restrictions on themselves than somebody might expect them to. But I think it's worth asking those questions. Again, Monsanto was probably asked 50 questions around what their intent was and what their interest was in joining the Alliance to End Hunger. And ultimately, it really was to learn and build relationships. And I don't think that's ever a bad thing for somebody to want to accomplish.
I had another question, if you don't. Recently, I went to the pediatric grand rounds at Dartmouth Hitchcock, and they were talking about a case study Basically, a child was born with severe genetic disabilities, and the only treatment was an untested experimental therapy. So the hospital refused to give it. It went all the way to the high courts. The high courts sided with the hospital, but then the public actually put on so much pressure on the hospital and the high courts that they overturned the issue. So I was wondering, in your career, have you ever seen sort of the public coming together around an issue to really shape the outcome? And sort of what can the public do with sort of these issues to help in like sort of those small ways?
So the one that I've seen, this is a little bit different an example, and it is not a specific case where there was sort of a groundswell of urgency around it, but the best instance I've seen in my entire quarter of a century in this space has been the Human Rights Campaign, and how relatively quickly they were able to make significant progress for LGBTQ rights at the federal level. What they accomplished in the course of really just a bit over a decade. I mean, obviously there was a ton of work leading up to that. I'm not trying to say this was just the early aughts that caused all of this change, but the acceleration in the way that they did it was by creating a structure where they were elevating the issues, but it also created space for individuals who identified as LGBTQ to share their story with their friends and family. And so all of a sudden it wasn't those people, which is a phrase that I just abhor, but it was, oh my gosh, it's Brent, who we've known since he was a baby, and I didn't know that this not being able to be true to himself had caused these challenges for him, and it personalized it so much. And that's something that the hunger community, the domestic hunger community, has tried to do, but I would say not nearly as effectively as the Equal Rights Campaign did, in getting folks who have at points in their life participated in SNAP or WIC or school meals to be more vocal with. Not, you'll see celebrities talk about it, which is better than nobody talking about it. But I think it would be, my sister-in-law telling her friends in their lovely gated community in St. Augustine, Florida, that, my niece is this thriving 20-year-old because they participated in WIC when they were pregnant with her. So that's where it, again, that's not the exact corollary to what you were suggesting in the Dartmouth case, but it's, getting that personal connection and that personal attention to it. I would say on the policy side too, if you can find folks who are tied to the policymaker who have those personal stories, this is another place where we saw it make a lot of difference around the opioid crisis, which, I mean, there's so many layers of that we can peel back. But just generally drawing attention to it, all of a sudden it started to become members of Congress's lifelong friend's child, or their niece, or in some cases their own child, who were affected by the opioid crisis, that drew it to that level of attention. So again, that personal connection, that alignment, wherever that happens to be.
Rebecca, I find that very relevant because we're beginning to see the harms of social media, right? I mean, almost like those stories of the LGBTQ community and the opioid crisis, but the extreme cases. I mean, Maddie, as an example, has had 7 friends die from suicide, where social media was a contributor. So I think that's really, thinking this through is a really great example.
Well, and I think too, the challenge of exactly that is we've all have seen the stories of, I mean, in some cases, really young kids who have been bullied over social media so severely that they've taken their own lives. But almost like hunger stories, they're out there so frequently that it almost diminishes the impact of the news story. I mean, how many more times can you see an emaciated child from Yemen or Syria before it starts to blur a little bit? It makes me sick to the stomach to say that in either instance. And as someone who's, both of my kids have had, some mental health challenges over the years, it's terrifying, these dark places that folks can find themselves. And then you layer on social media and what that does. I mean, social media and eating disorders is a whole other level of things where I've seen that play out too. And just the diet culture and how that gets perpetuated through selfies and all of that. So, so I think, those personal connections, not in the generic, Jane Doe, I've never heard of this person, but in the, wow, Rebecca Middleton has this personal story. I know Rebecca. I trust Rebecca. I'm connected to Rebecca, and that's really relevant. I mean, you know, having parents or students come and talk to members of Congress has an impact, even if there's not that personal relationship pre-existing there too. But you're a constituent, and you should matter to them. So yeah, the personal story, keeping it from being that thing over there that I can kind of ignore or feel disconnected from, to this thing that's really important and relevant to me.
Well, we're coming up on the hour, and I just want to say, I don't know if Sam or Tyler or Madison, I don't know that you got a chance to ask a question, but if you have a burning question you want to ask, we can probably do one more and then wrap it up, or I'm going to take silence as silence. But I want to thank Rebecca very much for her amazing insight. I know we could ask you probably about 50 other questions and go and learn so much from you over the week. But we really appreciate the time you took. And these are our core leadership lab participants, and it just shows that they're deeply interested in this topic and learning about advocacy. And it's so nice to hear from practitioners like you who have been there, and so we really appreciate you taking time out of your day, and amazingly, thank you for everything you're doing, to end hunger in this world. I'm gonna get all choked up. But anyway, it's so important, having seen it firsthand in my former life. It's sad, and I'm grateful for you for everything you're doing to make this world a better place. So we're grateful. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. I feel so fortunate every day to get to be in this role. One last thing, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I don't know if you all are on there, but it really, you talk about social media being a cause for good. It's a fantastic networking tool. And it's, one thing I would say, somebody who, hires a lot of folks, very often you'll get 50 or 100 or 200 resumes for a job. And as a hiring manager, you're scanning through them, and sometimes you'll miss one that you should pay attention to. A great way to make sure that yours doesn't get missed is if you have a connection to the organization, just reach out and say, hey, can you put in a good word for me? It doesn't mean you're going to get the job. It may not even mean that you get the interview, but it will mean that you'll get that extra look. So connect to me if there's an organization at some point that you're applying to, and you see that I'm connected there, reach out. Being appropriately assertive with LinkedIn, I think, is a really great professional tool to use as you head on out in the world. Sorry, Julie, you were trying to wrap up, and then I throw a bunch more in.
No, but it's 4 o'clock. It's perfect. That's a great way to end it. Thanks, Susan. Did you have any closing thoughts, or you're a closer?
No, I just feel like I am learning so much coming at this as an educator, and not really in a systemic policy or nonprofit even. I sat here and said public sector, private sector, and civil society org, right? I mean, that's on my little notes to go iron those out. So it's fantastic. And I just feel like we're all learning together. And the cross-generation piece, I just love.
Great. Thanks, guys. Have a good one. Enjoy your spring breaks, or good luck with the rest of your exams or your jobs, for those of you working right now. And we'll see you next time. The next one's going to be April 8th with Daryl Thompson, and that one will not be recorded. I'll send out more information about that. Okay.
Thank you so much.
All right,
Rebecca.
guys.
Thank you so much.
See you.
Thank you.
Bye.